Every single Ashkenazi Jew alive today, all 15 million of them, descends from a group of roughly 350 people, not 35,000, not 350,000, 350. A group smaller than the typical audience at a mid-sized college lecture hall. And for most of recorded history, nobody knew this. Not the rabbis, not the historians, not the people themselves. This is what DNA did to one of the oldest origin stories in human civilization. It didn't just fill in blanks. It rewrote entire chapters. And some of what it revealed, the people who expected to be vindicated, on both sides, really didn't want to hear. Let's go back to what everyone thought they knew. The story was straightforward for centuries. Ashkenazi Jews were the descendants of ancient Israelites. The exile from Judea under the Romans, 70 CE, the destruction of the Second Temple, the Great Diaspora, Jewish communities dispersed across the Mediterranean. Some moved into Western Europe, others pushed further north and east, eventually settling in the Rhine Valley of medieval Germany. That's where the name comes from, Ashkenaz, the Hebrew term for the German lands. From there, over the following centuries, communities moved eastward into Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus. By the early 20th century, this belt of Eastern European Jewish population was the demographic heart of global Jewry. And the origin story, ancient Middle Eastern people, displaced, preserved their identity across 2,000 years of exile in Europe, seemed settled, painful, but settled. This narrative had enormous weight, religious weight, cultural weight, political weight. The establishment of Israel in 1948 was partly justified by the continuity of this story, a people returning to the land their ancestors came from. The story wasn't just history, it was identity, legitimacy, meaning. And then, in 1976, a writer named Arthur Koestler threw a grenade into it. Koestler was not a fringe figure. He was a respected intellectual, a former communist turned anti-totalitarian, the author of Darkness at Noon, one of the most important political novels of the 20th century. And in 1976, he published a book called The 13th Tribe. The argument was simple and detonating. Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from ancient Israelites at all. They are descended from the Khazars. The Khazars were a Turkic people who dominated the steppes north of the Caucasus, roughly the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian, from the 7th to 10th centuries CE. What made them unusual was their religion. Their ruling class, at some point in the 8th or 9th century, converted to Judaism. Not all of them. The mass of the population was a mix of Tengrist animists, Muslims, and Christians. But the elite adopted Judaism, and the kingdom became officially Jewish, the only post-antiquity Jewish kingdom in history that wasn't located in the Cain Levant. Then the Khazar state collapsed under pressure from Kiev and Rus and other neighbors around the 10th century, and its population went somewhere. Koestler's argument was that they went west, that they dispersed into Eastern Europe, that the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Poland and Russia and Ukraine weren't Semites at all. They were Khazars in disguise. This theory had been floating in academic circles for a long time, but Koestler made it popular, and it immediately became a weapon. Anti-Semitic writers seized on it because if Ashkenazi Jews had no ancient connection to the Levant, then the entire foundation of Zionism was fraudulent, a European colonial project dressed up as ancestral return. Some Jewish intellectuals dismissed it with fury, precisely because of who was using it and why. The Khazar hypothesis didn't just ask a historical question. It was immediately recruited into one of the most charged political conflicts on Earth. For decades, the argument went nowhere because there was no way to settle it. Historians had fragments. Linguists argued about where Yiddish came from. Archaeologists dug in the steppe. Nobody could prove anything definitively. And then came the labs. The first major genetic studies on Ashkenazi Jews started appearing in the early 2000s. The technology was improving fast. Cheaper sequencing, larger sample sizes, better statistical tools for tracing ancestry through markers in the genome. And the people asking the questions were serious scientists at serious institutions. Harry Oster at NYU, Marcus Feldman at Stanford, the lab of David Reich at Harvard, which would later become arguably the most consequential ancient DNA research facility in the world. Here's what they expected to find, roughly: either a strongly Middle Eastern genetic profile consistent with diaspora from ancient Israel, or a strongly Central Asian/Turkic profile consistent with Khazar origin. A clean answer, one story or the other. What they found was neither, and it took years to understand what it actually meant. The first thing the data showed clearly was that the Khazar hypothesis was wrong. Not ambiguous, wrong. Ashkenazi Jews show no significant genetic affinity to the Turkic and Central Asian populations that would have contributed to Khazar ancestry. When researchers looked at the paternal lineages, the Y chromosome, which passes directly from father to son, a large portion of Ashkenazi Jewish Y chromosomes were clearly Middle Eastern in origin, not vaguely. Specifically, many of them cluster with populations from the Levant, modern Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrian Druze. The haplogroups are right. The distribution is right. There is ancient Israelite ancestry in Ashkenazi Jews. That part of the traditional narrative held. But then the maternal side complicated everything. When researchers looked at mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and traces the maternal lineage, the picture was completely different. A landmark study published in 2013 by a team led by Martin Richards at the University of Huddersfield analyzed mitochondrial genomes from over 600 Ashkenazi Jews and traced the lineages back as far as the data allowed. The conclusion was startling. Roughly 80% of Ashkenazi maternal lineages did not come from the Middle East. They came from Europe. Specifically, and this was the really unexpected part, they came predominantly from southern Europe, Italy, the Mediterranean coast, women who, by the genetic signatures, had European ancestry going back thousands of years. Not Middle Eastern women who had moved to Europe, European women who had, at some point, become part of Jewish communities. How? The most likely explanation, and this is where history and genetics have to work together, is that in the early centuries of the Common Era, as Jewish communities spread through the Roman Empire, there was substantial conversion. Roman women converting to Judaism, or becoming partners with Jewish men, and their descendants going on to form the core of what would become the Ashkenazi population. This isn't fringe speculation. It's consistent with what we know from Roman-era sources. Judaism was actually a fairly proselytizing religion in antiquity. That changed after Christianity became the state religion of Rome, and conversion was discouraged or prohibited. But in the first few centuries CE, conversion was real and not uncommon. And the genetics say it left a deep, durable mark. So the picture that emerged from the DNA was not one story, but two overlapping stories written into the same genome. Paternal lines from the ancient Middle East, maternal lines from southern Europe. A community that formed, really solidified into its distinctive genetic profile, somewhere in the Mediterranean world in the first centuries of the Common Era, and then moved north. Now here's where the founder effect comes back in. Because what the data also showed, and this was in some ways the most scientifically remarkable finding, is that at some point in the medieval period, the Ashkenazi population went through a severe genetic bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in size. Studies that modeled the demographic history of the Ashkenazi genome estimated that the entire modern population traces back to something like 350 to 800 founding individuals who lived approximately 600 to 800 years ago. The range varies by study and methodology, but the signal is consistent and strong. There was a small group of people living in medieval Europe, probably in the Rhineland or nearby regions, from whom everyone alive today is descended. This is why Ashkenazi Jews have a pattern of genetic diseases that is unlike any other population on Earth. Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, familial dysautonomia, BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations that dramatically elevate breast and ovarian cancer risk. These aren't random. They're the consequence of a founding population effect. When you descend from a small group, the rare mutations in that group become common in all their descendants. A harmful variant that appears once in the genome of one founder gets copied forward into every branch of the family tree that descends from that next person. By the time you have 15 million descendants, the mutation is everywhere, not because it was selected for, simply because the founder carried it and the population never had the genetic diversity to dilute it away. Think about what this means. There is a man, or a woman, who lived roughly in the 12th or 13th century CE, somewhere in medieval Germany or France, who carried a particular variant in the BRCA1 gene, that one person, and because of how the founder bottleneck worked, their variant is now carried by hundreds of thousands of people alive today. The consequences of one life, written in the DNA of a global population 8 centuries later. When David Reich's lab and others began putting the full picture together, it looked something like this. Ancient Israelite ancestry in the male line, European ancestry predominantly in the female line, the mixing probably concentrated in the early centuries of the Common Era in the Roman Mediterranean, followed by a gradual migration northward into Europe, and then a catastrophic narrowing somewhere in the medieval period. A bottleneck that reduced the entire founding stock to a few hundred individuals, followed by a dramatic recovery and expansion into the millions. Why the bottleneck? Nobody knows for certain. The medieval period was not kind to Jewish communities in Europe. The Crusades brought waves of massacre. The Black Death of the 14th century was accompanied by pogroms, with Jews blamed for the plague across dozens of European cities. Communities were expelled, from England in 1290, from France repeatedly, from the Rhineland cities multiple times. It's entirely possible that the bottleneck reflects one or more of these catastrophes, a moment when the surviving population was so small that all future Ashkenazi Jews trace back to whoever made it through. There's something almost unbearable about that, and also something strangely intimate. If you are Ashkenazi Jewish, the person sitting next to you at a Passover Seder is your cousin, not metaphorically, genetically. You share ancestors who were alive within the last millennium. The community isn't just a community in the cultural sense, it's a family in the literal biological sense, just spread very thin. So what does all of this do to the old argument? The Rhineland hypothesis versus the Khazar hypothesis? The DNA settled it on the narrow question. Khazar ancestry is not there in any meaningful quantity, but the answer that replaced it is stranger and more interesting than either side was arguing about. Ashkenazi Jews didn't come simply from ancient Israel. They came from a process, a mixing in the Mediterranean world, a formation of a distinct community, a journey north, a catastrophic narrowing, a recovery. They are, genetically, a bridge between the ancient Levant and ancient Europe, between the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The DNA doesn't simplify the origin story. It reveals that the real origin story was always more complex than the simple narratives on either side could accommodate. And this is where some people get uncomfortable, because the genetics have implications that cut in multiple directions. For those who wanted the Khazar theory to be true, usually because it served a particular political argument about Israel, the data is simply a refusal. The ancient Middle Eastern ancestry is real. It's in the genome. It can be measured. But for those who held the opposing political position too tightly, the genetics also complicate things. Because Ashkenazi Jews descend from ancient Israelites is not quite what the full picture shows. The maternal lineages are European. The bottleneck is medieval. The population's genetic distinctiveness comes not just from ancient origin, but from isolation and a very small founding group in the Middle Ages. The story is not pure transmission from antiquity. It's something messier and more human: migration, intermarriage, survival, catastrophe, recovery, and time. Does any of this change what it means to be Jewish? This is where scientists can hand off to everyone else, because it's genuinely not a question the data answers. Identity doesn't live in haplogroups. People have been asking for centuries what makes someone Jewish. Bloodline, faith, practice, culture, memory, and the DNA doesn't solve that argument. It just adds another layer of evidence to wrestle with. What the genetics does, powerfully, is demonstrate continuity in a way that even the most committed skeptic has to acknowledge. Whatever the Ashkenazi population is, wherever it came from, however it formed, it is genetically coherent, it is distinct, it has been distinct for a very long time, and it connects, through the paternal lines especially, to something genuinely ancient in the Levant. The thread is thinner and more complicated than the traditional story admitted. But it is there. And there's one more thing the DNA revealed that almost never gets talked about in these discussions. The same studies that analyzed Ashkenazi ancestry also looked at other Jewish populations: Sephardic Jews from Spain and North Africa, Mizrahi Jews from Iraq and Iran and Yemen, Ethiopian Jews, Georgian Jews. And what they found is that despite being separated for over 1,000 years, despite living on opposite sides of the world, despite speaking completely different languages and practicing Judaism in recognizably different ways, all these communities cluster together genetically, more closely with each other than with any of the non-Jewish populations they lived alongside. A Jew from Yemen and a Jew from Lithuania, separated for perhaps 2,000 years, are more closely related to each other than either is to their non-Jewish neighbors. That is an extraordinary finding. It means that across the full breadth of the diaspora, the entire scattered geography of Jewish history, the genetic thread held, not perfectly, not without admixture, but enough. Enough that modern genomics, looking at a few 100,000 positions in the genome, can tell you with high confidence, these people share a common origin, a real one, ancient enough to predate almost everything we think of as modern history. So here's where we land. The DNA did not confirm the story people had been told, but it also didn't destroy it. It did something more interesting. It found the real story underneath, the one that was always there, but too complicated to be captured in any single narrative. Half Middle Eastern, half European, formed in the ancient Mediterranean world, surviving a medieval catastrophe in a group small enough to fit in a single building, expanding across centuries into a population of millions, scattering across the globe, and somehow, genetically, staying recognizably themselves. That is not a myth. That is not a political argument. That is what is written in the cells of 15 million living people. If you find yourself sitting with a question right now about identity, about what ancestry actually means, about whether any of this changes how you think about your own heritage or someone else's, you're in good company. These findings have been debated in academic journals, in synagogues, in political forums, and they haven't produced a clean consensus on what it all means, only on what the biology shows. Drop that question in the comments. Not the political version of it, the honest version. What does it mean to you that a community's entire origin story turns out to be more complicated than anyone thought? That the truth is neither the myth nor the conspiracy, but something harder and stranger than both? If you want to go deeper on this, on the science of how ancient DNA has reshaped everything we thought we knew about human migration and population history, there's more coming. The Ashkenazi story is one thread, but there are others that are just as disorienting, just as real.